Hello there, you're watching African Perspective here on SABC News Channel. I'm Tipiso Makwetla. Starting in South Africa, where Lana Marks, the ambassador-designate of the United States of America to the country, says the U.S. administration has full confidence in President Cyril Ramaphosa and on how South Africa is dealing with the land question. Speaking to the media for the first time since her arrival in the country, Marks also indicated that she would like to see U.S. President Donald Trump visiting South Africa as part of strengthening relations with Africa. Our foreign editor, Sophie Mukwena, attended the briefing.
Marks, who arrived in the country last week, has hit the ground running. Marks is no stranger to South Africa. She was born in East London in the Eastern Cape.
Baie dankie.
That's 2 words.
En ek was heeltemal tweetalig. En Molo Ninjani. Sorry, that's not Afrikaans. isiXhosa.
And she has made a commitment to improving relations between Pretoria and Washington.
I would love for nothing more than President Trump to visit South Africa. And I know that President Trump was personally very anxious for me to arrive here. And when I became his candidate in November 2016, he personally told me how beautiful Cape Town was. And in terms of AGOA, South Africa enjoys all the privileges of AGOA. Our two governments are working collectively together on all aspects of this agreement.
President Trump was previously critical about South Africa's land reform process, but Marks says this will not affect relations between the two countries or her work.
In terms of land, nothing has happened at this time. There's been no problem with land seizures or anything like that we're aware of. We're very pleased on the U.S. side that things are being dealt with in a very transparent manner. We want to ensure going forward that there's a very, very good environment for my personal mandate to greatly increase trade and investment in South Africa.
Marks is fully aware that the role will also be to ensure that America's influence on Africa does not diminish. China and Russia have both strengthened their relations with the continent.
In terms of China, in terms of Russia, or any foreign nation, the United States strongly believes in foreign trade, but foreign and fair trade. And we strongly urge African nations and South Africa to scrutinize any agreement, any business deal with any foreign nation to protect their sovereign assets and make sure that these deals are transparent and don't create tremendous debt, number one. Our model of business together is through investment, through economics and that aspect of things. So our model together with South Africa is very different. The United States wants to increase its investment. And my focus, as I said prior, is obviously to increase this in all aspects. There's many new ventures in South Africa with the United States, pension funds, whatever it is, and they are producing positively. And across the board, all sectors, we want to increase business.
Sophie Mukwena, SABC News, Johannesburg.
South Sudanese leaders have failed to meet the November 12th deadline to form a unity government. President Salva Kiir and opposition leader Riek Machar met in Uganda in a last-ditch effort to resolve outstanding disputes that are preventing the formation of a coalition government in time for the deadline. Conflict broke out in South Sudan in 2013, 2 years after it became an independent nation. Kiir and Machar signed a peace deal in September of 2018, both sides blaming each other now for not meeting milestones stipulated by the deal. So today, South Africa's Deputy President David Mabuza welcomed the developments made so far in resolving the South Sudan conflict. Mabuza, who also serves as a special envoy to South Sudan, Earlier on Wednesday, I met with Uganda's President Yoweri Museveni in Uganda. Correspondent Leon Senyange is in Uganda's capital, Kampala. Leon, let's talk about the latest outcomes of the various meetings that have been held. What are they?
Well, it's very interesting, the topic that is South Sudan. And like you've said, just today, Deputy President Mabuza was in Entebbe. He met President Yoweri Kaguta Museveni of Uganda. Of course, the key issue there is the matter of the peace process, or leading to the peace process in South Sudan. They, however, had a closed-door meeting that lasted about 3 hours. So definitely the matters therein, of course, stem from the meeting that was held again in Entebbe just last week between the two warring factions, that is the president of South Sudan, Salva Kiir, and his opposition, the opposition leader, Riek Machar.
So, Leon, we've heard reports saying that the power-sharing government will now be pushed back by another 100 days. How true are these reports?
Well, the decision, of course, comes out after failure to meet the November 12th deadline. Definitely, there were desperate measures to ensure that this particular transition actually happens. Now, of course, mixed reactions on the extension of 100 days. But then definitely there's a lot of work to do within that 100 days until when there has to be an agreement on the power sharing process there. But, of course, critical tasks have not been achieved even since the September 2018 signing of the agreement. Now, of course, with the deadline delay and now the extension by 100 days, there's still a lot of work to do, which therein includes issues around the security arrangement and also the integration of the different forces. So definitely there's much to look into going into the next 100 days, but of course lots of pressure coming through for the parties to sit down and entirely have a peace agreement.
So, Leon, I want to talk about exactly that, the integration of the various forces. It seems the other side, the opposition, Riek Machar, saying that Salva Kiir has not kept his agreement of the disbursement funds. I think it's something like $100 million US. Has there been any conversation around this, how this will be facilitated?
Well, it's been a tough situation for especially the opposition leader, Riek Machar, there. One of the issues there, he says and claims, are that Salva Kiir has not met part of the bargain, so he definitely can't quite put his hand into a matter in which one party is not living up to what has been agreed upon. So that in any way puts the South Sudan conflict resolution very much in a precarious situation. But like I said earlier, there's a lot of demand at this point in time to ensure that there is an agreement, a peace agreement, and that all the fighting that has been going on in Sudan, past and even present, finally comes to one end. It may still be a difficult ask for both parties, but definitely the two have to come to a particular agreement to ensure that this comes to an end.
And as you say, Leon, that they have to come to a particular agreement. So the optics would be good in them being in Entebbe, talking it out. But are they saying anything, either of them, Salva Kiir and Riek Machar, on what will it take to finally agree?
It will take quite a lot of convincing for the two to entirely agree to a power sharing agreement. The past definitely therein is that Riek Machar, the fight that broke out a couple of years ago entirely stems from the fact that Riek Machar tried to oust Salva Kiir, and with the opposition fighters therein, none would take any of it. So it's quite hot for the two parties, but ultimately it will take quite a lot of convincing. The different blocs have tried to come through and mediate these particular talks, with several discussions coming through from Ethiopia, the bloc of the Intergovernmental Authority, IGAD, the East African leaders as well. Now, like we've seen, the support coming through again from the South South African government. So yes, there's been quite a lot of effort, but I particularly think that it's been a desperate ask from the parties to ensure that they finally come and settle and have a conflict resolution pact here to ensure that South Sudan finally comes to peace and its people can live in harmony thereafter.
And as you say, there's been a lot of support regionally for both sides to reach some sort of agreement and bring an end to the war. Just, Leon, what are they saying is a point of no return, as in a middle ground that must be reached and agreed on, the regional players in this case?
Of course, the middle ground is essentially stems from how the integration of the forces will be done. Both parties have had their forces fighting each other. Both parties have had their forces not agreeing at particular issues of discussion. And of course, military takes a very big stake in the governance of South Sudan matters. So, and both leaders have had their armies taking control of different areas. So one definitely will have to give up the powers in the various areas that are under their control. And that, of course, is one of the giveaways that must be compromised. But it definitely becomes a very difficult ask for a party like the opposition leaders in Riek Machar and his army, and just as well for Salva Kiir. So yes, very difficult decisions to make, for the both sides, and it may definitely take a while, in my opinion, until we have an agreement coming on the table.
All right, thank you very much, Leon. Leon Sinyange, our correspondent out there in Kampala, in Uganda. Remaining in the country, more than 70 people could be charged in court after the police in Uganda raided a bar in the capital, Kampala. He arrested the popular spot hosting the LGBTIQ community. It's the latest attack on minority groups.
The operation in the capital resulted in the arrest of 120 people. Authorities say it was a raid on patrons who were smoking narcotics. Activists, however, claim that the charges are a cover-up for targeted persecution of the already vulnerable LGBT community.
I think that there has to be an exception. You know, people must accept the fact that this country has a large number of LGBTI people who are deserving of protection, who are deserving of equal rights like anybody else.
The raid comes weeks after Uganda's Minister for Ethics and Integrity said there were efforts to bring the anti-homosexuality bill back into Parliament.
The Uganda government has since denied it has any plans to reintroduce the bill. In 2014, a constitutional court nullified the anti-homosexuality law because it lacked the necessary two-thirds majority to have it passed in Parliament.
Legislators behind the bill say they are trying to protect national values that are based on cultural and religious beliefs.
What is at stake is the foundation of the nation. What is at stake is the family, institution of family. What is at stake is the sovereignty of our nation. And what is at stake is the future of our children.
Same-sex relationships are illegal in Uganda. Existing laws criminalize homosexual behavior, with prison sentences lasting up to 14 years. Despite the legislation, some strides in raising awareness about LGBT, activists say, are being made.
The debate about LGBT has become a national debate. While a large part of it is still toxic, the fact that the debate is being had itself is a good thing. And I think that it might be a long time before we get to a state in which we accept equality for LGBT people, but we are on our way there.
Uganda has faced widespread international condemnation over LGBT legislation, with international donors threatening to suspend or withdraw aid. Leon Sinyange, SABC News, Kampala, Uganda.
What should you do to avoid getting ill?
Eat healthy, not to do drugs, not to smoke.
To learn more about some of the most common illnesses and how to avoid them, join Dr. Silomo Down each week and get all your health questions answered by experts.
What are those signs that people should look out for and say, this is time for me to go and seek help.
It is very important to identify and address those problems as early as possible.
You are a fighter, you are a warrior, and you will get better.
Right here on Health Talk.
Welcome back. Zimbabwe's rainy season is behind by a little over a month. This has left a devastating impact on the once breadbasket of southern Africa. Scientists predict that average temperatures will rise by 3% and annual rainfall will decline by up to 18% in the region by the end of the century. Nwabolani and Effet Musekiwa took a look at how some rural communities in Zimbabwe are adapting climate-smart agricultural practices in order to mitigate the severe impact of climate change on their livelihoods.
Marginalized and rural communities are the first to bear the devastating effects of climate change. And it's no different for the people living in Mutoko district, northeast of Zimbabwe's capital, Harare. The community is getting first-hand experience of the climate change impact. Over the past 2 decades, the area has seen gradual increase in temperatures and frequent heat waves.
During the hot season, especially during this time, October, November, this place is very hot. The temperatures reach extremes. And then coupled with the heat wave that's been hitting the country over the past years, it has been really bad. And without the water, children used to suffer dehydration. We used to have complaints of headaches nearly every day. And then we ended up limiting children, especially the infant classes. We can't dismiss them around 12 to 2 when they are supposed to be dismissed because of the heat. They are affected on their way home and we are called that children have collapsed on the way.
As the drought across Zimbabwe continues, access to water is the biggest challenge facing residents. This hot and dry region receives low and erratic rainfall, averaging less than 700 millimeters annually. There aren't any permanent streams in this district, and during the dry periods, nearby shallow wells quickly dry up. The situation is so bad that school children are forced to carry their own water to school. In 2016, this school, with an enrollment of more than 600 students, faced closure after the rise of numerous health issues relating to the absence of water.
For the past years, due to this drought, there was no any clean, safe water for even everyone, the school, the community. You know how the school works. There are so many children at large, and you can see diseases. They are more prone where we have more and more where the people are overcrowded. So the school was a central hub for all these diseases, especially malaria, where we have the cholera. Because of shortage of water, it was not a conducive environment for people, every human being. It wasn't healthy for the healthy human beings to survive under the harsh conditions without water. So they came up to say, if this problem continues, we are going to make a closure for the school.
Faced with this dire situation, Plan International Zimbabwe has intervened. They've drilled and installed a solar-powered borehole at the school, bringing back lost hope for neighboring communities.
Climate change has created a new life in Chariwa A. It has forced people to realize that they can have value in other farming practices previous to what they were doing. So you'll find at every point, at every water point, we've surrounded every water point with a sustenance and livelihood program. So a school that has been provided with a solar-powered bore becomes a hub of information and training. Villagers come to that central hub, they learn fishery production, they learn piggery production, chicken production, climate-smart agricultural practices in the gardens, they learn chicken rearing, and take these projects and practice them at household level.
For the community, the benefits are immeasurable, and for the intended beneficiaries, the concept has reached home.
Here at Kagande Primary School, we have 5 projects which are goat rearing, gardening, piggery, fish farming and poultry. Goat rearing gives manure to the garden. The garden gives food to the goat rearing. The garden gives food to the piggery. The piggery gives manure to the garden. the piggery gives food to the fish farming. From all our projects, the feeding program gets meat and vegetables. All our 5 projects provide income to our school. The bore water source is the rehab to all our projects.
Just a single borehole has transformed the lives of thousands in this once impoverished community. Other similar innovations are needed to assist communities adapt to climate change. Across the world, climate change is threatening food and water security, human health, as well as social, economic and political stability. It's reshaping society and changing the natural world as we know it. Noma Polani, SABC News.
The world will need at least $264 billion in the next 10 years to end preventable maternal deaths, eliminate gender-based violence and harmful practices. The funds are also to meet the family planning needs of women in high-priority countries. This is according to new research released in Nairobi, emerging on the sidelines of the International Conference on Population and Development at ICPD 25.
The second day of the International Conference on Population and Development got underway here in Nairobi today. Now, topics on discussion include sexual and reproductive health rights, maternal mortality, and especially in Africa, where at least 831 women are still dying every day during childbirth. But tonight, we will concentrate on the issue of girls and children's rights. And I'm joined by the CEO of Plan International to just take us through what exactly is happening on the continent, the situation of the girl child here, and exactly where Africa stands in terms of the rights of the girl child. Thank you very much for having us. Please begin by introducing yourself, because your name is very long and very complicated. And then tell us the situation of the girl child on the continent.
Well, thanks, Sarah, and thanks for having me on the program. I am A.B. Albrechtsen, and I'm the Global CEO of Plan. So on the continent, we have seen a lot of governments adopting very good legislation in line with ICPD. But unfortunately, implementation is falling short, particularly for the adolescent girl. So we're seeing, for example, that 30% of all girls get married before the age of 18. We are seeing many girls under 18 becoming pregnant. Teen pregnancy is actually growing in many parts of the continent. And we're also seeing that very young children, aged 10 to 14, are also becoming pregnant because they don't have any information. And when they become pregnant, they are ostracized from their communities. They are not going to school anymore, so they're losing out on many fronts.
And this conference here is discussing, among other things, the issue of the girl child. What, as Plan, do you bring on the table?
So Plan International has worked for 40 years in most African countries. We work very much on the issue of ending child marriage, on ending teenage pregnancy, and also trying to shine a light on the most vulnerable children, the girls that really don't have any voice, that are not seen, heard, or even valued by their families and communities. So that's what Plan International is bringing. In terms of specific commitments, we have put girls' leadership and agency at the center of our commitment to make sure that the girls are actually seen and heard in decision-making. And also we have put programming for ending early and forced marriage, ending teenage pregnancy, and busting the harmful practices around teenage sexuality and the reality that girls live.
I want us to stay on that topic of teenage pregnancies. Take, for example, it is the exam season here in Kenya. And one of the issues that always comes up every time we're having exams is that, in this and this school, we have this and this number of young girls who will be doing their exams in hospital because they have just delivered. Or maybe, let me give you the figure, 500,000 young girls got pregnant last year here in Kenya. And that number draws across the whole continent. It's not just in Kenya. So what should be done and what is lacking now? Where is the gap? Why and who's making these young girls pregnant?
Well, first of all, you mentioned we need boys and young men to be involved in the conversation too. There's too much finger pointing at the girl. So it does take two to get pregnant. The other thing is information. The governments across the continent have committed to comprehensive sexuality education. This now has to be implemented. Schools, teachers, parents need to be well informed about what it does to benefit their communities. If girls and boys are informed, they actually they delay sexual activity. There's lots of evidence to that. So making sure that that happens is probably the primary activity that needs to start.
Are you talking about the controversial comprehensive sex education? We know that some members of the religious community are actually not here because they are opposed to the comprehensive sex education. So maybe it's time you tell us what exactly is comprehensive sexual education? What is entailed in that syllabus?
So for us and where it does exist, comprehensive sexuality education is age-appropriate information about sexuality, how to become pregnant, how to prevent pregnancy, how to delay pregnancy. This information, if a girl or a boy doesn't have it, it really is impossible for them to prevent pregnancy. We know that there are many communities that are against this because they feel it violates basic core values. What we have seen across the world is that when young people have information, they delay sexual activity. It doesn't actually promote promiscuity. And I think if we can have that conversation with religious leaders to show them the evidence, I think they may be convinced that this is actually information that's required.
Yesterday, when the Kenyan president was delivering his address, he talked about Kenya signing and pledging to end female genital mutilation by 2022, a win by all standards. Is it achievable?
I think it's achievable. I also think ending early and forced marriage is achievable. It will take a concerted effort. It will take a concerted effort to get healthcare into communities. It will take a concerted effort to really make sure that education is happening in every single community. But it is doable. We've seen, for example, in Ethiopia, a committed government get health extension workers into the most far-flung communities of that country and radically bring down FGM, radically bring down early and forced marriage, radically bring down teenage pregnancy. So learning from the successes on the continent, I would say, yes, it's doable.
Most of the countries, and especially on this side of the continent, are affected by conflict. How does conflict affect the amount of time a young girl stays in school, prevents her from, sexual-based violence and all that, and keeps the SDGs moving and probably giving Africa a chance to attain SDGs by this set time?
So conflict is detrimental to everybody. But it's particularly detrimental to girls and young women. They drop out of school to protect their parents, promote early marriage. The unprotected environment of conflict, of course, radically increases rape, sexual abuse and violence. So peace processes, obviously peace processes that involve women and young women, we know have greater chance of succeeding and being sustained over time. So promoting peace processes with women and girls at the table is one. Making sure that the humanitarian community that's responding during those crises takes a feminist lens on their work and becomes a bit less gender blind, and make sure that that sexual reproductive health services are available, particularly services addressing the post-rape care and the trauma that young women face.
5 years to 2030, the deadline that the world set itself to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, including ending all forms of gender-based violence, including women in decision-making, ensuring that we end female genital mutilation, that all girls get education. Is Africa on track to meet any of these SDGs?
The reality is that no country in the world is on track to reach the goal on gender equality. That's the sad story. So while Africa is also falling behind, they're not alone. So what we have to do is to really concentrate on what works, make investments for children and adolescents and young women so that they can fuel the changes that need to happen in their own countries so that we can accelerate the pace of change.
When the curtain comes down tomorrow, what do you want to see come out of this meeting for the girl child?
I want to see renewed energy. I want to see that the governments that have shown deep commitment to the ICPD agenda, historically and here at the meeting, have made commitments to move a lot of the agenda forward, that they go back and implement it and walk the talk.
Thank you very much. So this meeting is not just about commitments, but it is also looking back and looking ahead to see if these commitments are actually implemented to the letter. It is also about leaving no one behind, and especially women and girls. Every year, at least 30% of young girls who enroll in schools in Southern Africa drop out of school due to teenage pregnancies. This is one of the issues that is under discussion here in Nairobi, where the International Conference on Population and Development is underway. Experts want to discuss why girls are not completing at least 12 years of school, indicating that the longer a young woman stays in school, the better their prospects for the future. And so to discuss these issues, we have Dr. Manala Makua from the Department of Health in South Africa to just take us through these issues and much more. Tell me, Doctor, thank you for having us. And we want to understand, why is it so difficult for young girls, not only in South Africa, but even in the East African region, to stay longer in school? Why are we seeing more teenage pregnancies across the continent?
Thank you very much for having me. I think the first thing is when we talk about challenges that are facing young people, we make them feel like they are the victims and they are the ones who are at fault and they are the ones who are supposed to come up with a solution. I think the one thing that I want to put across is that when you talk about education, basic education, it's mainly focusing on developing young people to become employees. And they forget that a human being comprises of a physical, social, mental, and spiritual being. And they don't happen sequentially, they all happen at once. While they're taking care of their social needs or socio-economic needs of making them to become entrepreneurs or being employed, their social needs are equally at the same time a priority. That is why you hear in most side events that are happening in this conference, we've emphasized in the issues around sexual and reproductive health. Mm-hmm. We know that it's not a common phenomenon amongst many countries of older people engaging with young people to have an open discussion around issues that involve sexual and reproductive health. I always give an example to say it takes 12 years or more to prepare a young person to become an educator. Mm-hmm. But we're not taking enough investment to prepare this young person to become a parent, to become a mother, to become a father. We're thinking that when they are now adults, they will have a crash course of now to become a better parent, a better mother, or a better father. I think that's where we're getting it wrong. Because if we build the education as part of socialization, as part of a curriculum, as part of a common knowledge, then when they get to a situation where now they are faced with issues around being sexually active or their sexual rights being violated, they're likely to come up, talk about it, discuss it, report it, or even resist it.
We are talking about girls getting pregnant at the age of 11 in some countries as early as 10. And you seem to be advocating that we teach sex education in schools, an issue that has raised a lot of controversy here in Nairobi, I'm sure you know, with the Catholic Church saying you want early sex debut for our children.
I think we need to also respect the fear of our elderly in terms of what we want to teach our young people. I do not blame the religious organizations or any other people who are actually afraid to confront the situations that are teaching sexual education. I think the way we need to be approaching it as a world is to make the conversation to be an open amongst the adults themselves first, and then equip adults to be confident and be educated enough to have a discussion with young people. Because if you do that, then it doesn't have to be done by an educator in a classroom. So any adult person will do the education wherever she is or he is.
Because the numbers talk for themselves. We have, across the continent, young girls between the ages of 15 and 24 getting pregnant and getting HIV/AIDS. And then among the men, it is between the ages of 40 and 54 that are getting HIV/AIDS. So is it what we call in South Africa the blesser, and what we call in the East African nations the sponsor kind of phenomena that we are seeing? Is it the older people that are actually preying on the girls, do you think? Or who actually is sleeping with these young girls?
I think that is what we see is as an obvious phenomenon, but allow me to indicate that there are deeper conversations beyond that. The social determinants around health needs is what drives the situation. If I may, if you would remember, if you take the continent 15, 20 years ago, at the era of high prevalence of HIV, we ended up having a lot of households being headed by young people, some very as young as the very ages that you're citing at 10 years, and we allowed them to continue. They don't have a parental figure, they don't have support, they don't have anything. They need to survive. So they learned those tricks at a very early age, and then you know how it happens. You learn one, you teach one, it then becomes a trend. So from that era, it continued. We never broke the cycle where we would say it is wrong to have a child-headed family and not to support a child-headed family. And when you get to that situation, equally as parents or as elderly, we are actually being blamed because we use our young people as a way of getting out of our own situation of poverty. Because some of those young people, not that they do not have parents, but parents are also eager to have themselves and their kids get out of poverty and allow marriage as early as 14 years. So it's becoming a vicious cycle. So the only way to break the cycle is have the conversation, parents to parent, equip them, then allow young people to young people before we expect intergenerational dialogue. It will not happen before the people in the same generation are confident and comfortable talking about it. Let me touch an issue about something that you spoke about, the blessers or the supporters and all that. I think if you look at the very Tembisa model that is very famous from South Africa that tries to describe a phenomenon of HIV transmission and all other sexual transmitted diseases, we need to understand that physiologically a body of a woman develops faster than a body of a man, especially in terms of sexual needs. So what then happens is the women are likely to look like they are matured because now they're showing signs where they start to develop signs during puberty, and then they deceive someone who's looking at them, and they look at them and they think that they are older. Unlike their counterparts as boys, you look at a 14-year-old boy, he's still a child. It doesn't even show the signs of getting matured. And that in itself, that's what's one of the things that attracts intergenerational. While we could blame elderly men of perpetuating and taking advantage and making children who are vulnerable to become the victims of the circumstances, but also we need to understand that they are also being tempted by the circumstances because they themselves as men, they need to understand what do we describe as a mature woman or girl who is suitable to become a partner. Not to be a sex agent, but to become a partner.
So for a long time as a continent, we have buried our heads in the sand. So we're here in this conference and we are talking. What would you want to hear the leaders here, or what would you want to tell them?
I think what I want to see coming up out of this conference is, while we acknowledge and appreciate the fact that we have started the conversation, we still get lost into generalizing concepts. I think it's time, as Africa, as continent, as the globe, to become very specific about the things that we are addressing. We cannot continue to plan to have a better scripted information about sexuality while 10-year-olds are falling pregnant. We need to be very specific to say, for a 10-year-old, if she's pregnant, then someone must be accountable, and there should be consequences, because there's no way that a 10-year-old can give a consented sex.
It's rape.
It's a trap. And what happened is, because we have the laws that are so weak that when it happens, it's then negotiated and then it's not being reported, and then we hide it behind get her married, and then we correct, and then we're thinking that now is becoming a correct thing. It can't be correct. Even a 15-year-old, they are still babies. They still have to play. They still have to enjoy being kids. So let's protect them. So I think what I want to see out of this conference is, let's rather focus on the specific interventions which will continue to protect the young girls and boys of this continent.
And we will not end this conversation without talking about contraceptives. An issue of contraceptives is coming up, and they're saying maybe it's time we also spoke openly about contraceptives to the young girls.
I cannot agree more. I always get confronted to say, do we have a contraceptive package for young people? Unfortunately, the process and the mechanism of falling pregnant is the same. And therefore, we do not have the contraceptives that we would say this is for young people and this is for older women. But what we need to be looking at is to get young people to be educated to understand that you need to have a method that will not disturb your process of developing, either in terms of education or your social space or your economic space. So advocating for methods that will be long-term, less side effects, comfortable, reliable, not provoking the need to have sex, that's what's critical.
And don't you think, again, you will be provoking the religious community or people who feel these are not family values?
I think we sometimes, while we acknowledge the best value that religion play in our lives, we also need to understand that what informed the religious value was the tradition where there was never an open communication. I think we need to engage even the religious community to such an extent that they need to provide us with options and alternatives and methodology of facing reality. Because we cannot continue to say they are saying this, we are saying this. We need to get to a situation where we say, if I need to tell my 10-year-old that if you have sex with a male partner, you're going to fall pregnant, is there a better way of saying it while we're still respecting the moral values, the religious values of our society?
So the conference comes to a close on Thursday. It is a conference that is emphasizing on the need for choice, but also on the need to reach zero targets for maternal mortality, for child deaths, and also for domestic violence across the world.
Right, from East Africa back to Southern Africa, the Second Africa Investment Forum securing $40.1 billion in deals. That's nearly 6 trillion in South African rands. The 3-day conference came to a close today. Organizers had set their sights on doubling last year's investment commitments of $38 billion. My colleague Nompumlelo Siziba spoke to President of the African Development Bank, Akinwumi Adesina. From all of us here, it's good night.
This is become right now a global
platform for anybody that wants to invest in Africa. This year we have a record number of delegates, 2,038 delegates coming from all over the world. You have right here 109 countries that are represented with investors. You've got 1,600 investors, from outside of Africa. And the thing that's actually quite interesting out of it is you got 48 African countries, you got 61 non-African countries, all here in Africa, talking about transactions, talking about deals. That is phenomenal. The Africa Investment Forum has become the global platform for investing in Africa, and we are so delighted that it's working out so well.
Of course, there's going to be investor interest across different sectors, but from your analysis so far, which sectors are getting the most attention across the continent?
Oh, and when God created the heavens and the earth, He said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And so the whole area of energy continues to be the key issue. So energy is the biggest ticket item. Infrastructure, transport, very important. Agriculture, agro-processing is picking up quite a lot. We also see quite a lot of interest in the healthcare sector, in particular pharmaceutical, for example, infrastructure for healthcare. We also see quite a lot of interest as well in private equity funds that are looking to put money together to diversify their portfolio to invest in different sectors in Africa. And I'm also very interested, you'll be very interested to know that there's a lot of interest in financing women businesses. We have a fund here called Alethea Identity Fund.
We spoke to them earlier.
Yeah, exactly. A terrific fund, and that's going on. So these are the critical areas that we are seeing a lot of interest in. And of course, the biggest item here is also going to be a lot in LNG, oil and gas industry sometimes, yeah.
In terms of one of the areas that people worry about on the African continent are things like policy certainty. Are we communicating those messages right at a political level about political will to make it easy to do business and invest on the continent?
Well, absolutely. We had the participation of heads of state at this particular forum, and that's very, very unique. When the heads of state come to this forum, they actually don't come with prepared speeches, right? Because everything is done within boardroom conversations. The investors are not used to doing Your Excellency, Our Excellency. They just want to see transactions. So I'm delighted that our heads of state have gotten that particular perspective. They come into the boardrooms, they chair their boardrooms as chief executive officers of their own countries. And that gives a lot of confidence, a lot of assurance to the investors that the policy, the legal, the regulatory environments for their investments to thrive are going to be in place. And it's not just central governments. You also have governors, and you have the premier of Gauteng here, sitting in boardrooms and all of that. That is important to give assurance to the investors. Of course, we have the world of multilateral finance institutions been here, and it's important for us because we have the instruments to help them to de-risk investments, whether it's political risk, whether it's financial risk, market risk, or project risk. We have those instruments to help them to be able to de-risk all of their projects. And finally, is that we bring to this platform a huge pipeline of quality bankable projects that are actually standardized, that will reduce the transaction cost or the search cost of the investors trying to look for bankable projects in Africa. So it's an aggregation point for bankable projects.
And obviously these projects, they're variable, aren't they, in terms of their size, the length of time it will take to complete the investment and so on and so forth. So how do you measure success from one year to the next? Because obviously not all projects will be completed from one year to the next.
No, actually, no. The forum is not an event. It's more than an event. It actually goes on. We have a digital transactional platform that goes on throughout the year. And so, transactions come onto the platform, investors, blast is issued, crowd investors around them, and we try to accelerate closure of financial transactions. And so, for example, I'll give you two good examples of, like this year, we're so excited about is, in South Africa last year, right here, there was a promise made, a transaction called the Accra Sky Train, in which South African investors were going to invest in Accra, for the Sky Train. And this year, we were here, and it's done. They signed a concession agreement in a very, very short period of time for a $2.6 billion transaction. Just yesterday, we did a cocoa board, which is a syndication of $600 million of financing for Ghana's agency for buying cocoa, processing cocoa, exporting cocoa, and so on. With this $600 million, ourselves as multilateral finance institutions for $250 million and $350 million by Credit Suisse. And so it just tells you the kind of speed at which things come together. I like to say, here we promise, here we deliver.
Indeed, I heard your speech. So last year, some $38.7 billion worth of pledges were made in terms of commitment to African projects. This year, what's your estimation? I know you're going to be telling us a little bit later what that key quantum is, how much has been raised, but is it pretty much in line with what you were expecting for this year?
I think we're going to look very good. If you look at the energy in the boardrooms, the number of investors that are here, the range of projects that are being discussed, I think we're going to look really very good. My mom, over Christmas, I always like to keep my gifts. My mom said, open it only on Christmas Day. And so I think we'll know later today.
You'll only open the Christmas gift for us at 3 o'clock this afternoon. One last thing, is this going to be a continuation that is the event of the Africa Investment Forum every year going forward? And what do you think needs to happen for us to continue the momentum so that come year 5, people don't think, oh, it's that forum again?
No, because this is a very different forum. This is not a conference. This is a 100% transactional forum where deals happen. When was the last time in Africa that you had going into boardroom conversations in anywhere in Africa? This year, $67 billion in conversations around deals. Last year, $48 billion of conversations around deals. And that is what we are doing. The amount of financing gap we have for infrastructure in Africa alone is anything between $68 billion and $108 billion a year.
Yeah.
And so you can either look at that as a problem. I don't. I see that as a massive investment opportunity. And so this forum is basically saying we're not just going to sit around and be talking deficit, right? We got to talk opportunities. And so how do we package projects? How do we make sure that we get folks to look at Africa as a viable investment destination and help them to change the lenses which they look at Africa? Africa is not looking for aid, you see. Africa is looking for investments. And what this forum will continue to do is to make that case for Africa, not by talking about it, but actually showing that the bankable deals are there, the transactions can be closed, and we are there on this platform helping investments to land in Africa, like let me say, like a South African airline plane landing on a smooth runway.
And what's beautiful is that it's not just Americans and Europeans and Asian people coming to invest on the continent. It's Africans investing in other African countries.
Absolutely.
As well.
And this is the phenomenal thing about this forum, because Africans themselves don't even understand sometimes the opportunities in other African countries.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the investments that you're actually seeing here is actually by Africans themselves investing in other African countries. If you take, for example, the situation since 2003 to 2019, right? You look at intra-Africa investments, in which case Africans investing in other African countries, it's about $102 billion.
Yeah.
And there are 5 countries that top that. South Africa is probably 40% of that in terms of outbound investments. You got Nigeria, you got Morocco, you got Egypt, and you got Kenya. These are the biggest ones. And so we want to see a lot more, especially given the Africa Continental Free Trade Area that opens up a market, a collective market of $3.3 trillion. So we've got to make sure that Africans can travel to other African countries. We have to make sure that we develop the capital markets to mobilize the savings pool to be able to get companies listed across different stock exchanges. And we have to also make sure that we provide financing. That's what we are doing as African Development Bank, to investors in local currency, so they can invest in different projects in local currency.
But Mr. Adesina, you know what my problem is that these things that you've mentioned, they're not going to happen overnight, and yet the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is supposed to be kicking off next year. Are we as Africans, are we ready for it? That implies borders opening. We know we've had problems here in South Africa of late around, freedom of movement and, Africans not necessarily trusting each other. Are we ready 12 months, 18 months hence? Are we going to have open borders?
Well, first and foremost, let's see where we've come, right? So you have now the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Treaty signed on by 54 African countries. That is phenomenal, right? The African Development Bank, we provided $5 million to the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat, which is based in Ghana, to start operations. There's a lot of things that actually will make, as you said, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area to work. The critical one is infrastructure. Now, look, as African Development Bank, we were not waiting, for the Africa Continental Free Trade Area before we've been investing in all the things we needed. In ports, in rail, the Nakala port, we financed it. You look at the Kazungula Bridge, we financed that. We are financing a lot of digital infrastructure that will enable digital payments. We're financing massive things on energy, including financing ESCOM. Here we put in $4 billion for ESCOM. And as I always say, ESCOM, in my view, is providing energy not only for South Africa, by the way, for the entire SADC region to move up the manufacturing capacity that the region has. And so we have all the elements in place.